Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is a new series I'm starting called Magic from Zero. Magic the Gathering is seeing an unprecedented rise in new players, and especially there are a lot of people who are getting into the game outside of the traditional path of having a friend teach them. If you want to learn to play Magic, this series is a great place to start. I'll go over everything you need to know, and the only thing that I assume you already know is that Magic is a card game. But, I guess I already told you that, so we really are starting from zero. Ready? Let's get started. First, some big picture stuff. Your goal in Magic is to bring your opponent's life total down to zero. There are other ways to win, but this is by far the most common. Even though the gameplay is generally the same, there are different formats of Magic that people like to play. This is similar to how a basketball player might play a one-on-one pickup game, or a more competitive 5v5 league, or even a casual format like 21 or Horse. Players' starting life total depends on the format of Magic that they're playing, with 20 life being the standard for 1v1 formats and 30 or 40 being the most common for multiplayer formats. In contrast to other card games like poker or bridge, Magic is a TCG, or trading card game. This means that each player builds their own deck out of the cards available to them, and then they shuffle up and play. Deck size, what cards you can use, and how many copies of the same card that you can include are also dependent on the format. The trading part of trading card game hints at one of the ways to acquire cards, trading with others. Players can also buy loot boxes, booster packs, and open cards from them, or just buy individual cards from game stores or online sellers. Magic cards have a color-coded expansion symbol that shows their rarity, with black being the most common, silver being uncommon, gold being rare, and red being mythic, the highest rarity. Cards can vary widely in how expensive that they are, and the rarity only tells part of the story, so look cards up online before selling or trading, or only deal with trusted stores and community members who can be relied on not to rip you off. So this is a Magic card. Cards in hand are one of the primary resources that Magic players think about. You start the game with 7, and you draw 1 on each of your turns. In two-player formats, though, the player who goes first skips the draw on their first turn to compensate for the advantage of getting to play first. This is known as the play-draw rule. The card's name appears in the top left corner. This one's named Lightning Bolt. Over the years, Magic has changed the basic card layout a few times, so if you're dealing with an older version of a card, you might find it looks a little bit different, but everything is still in generally the same spot. Especially recently, Magic has printed cards aimed at collectors which depart wildly from the standard card layout, but even these generally have the name in a conspicuous spot near the top, meaning that you can use an app or a website to look everything else up. In the upper right corner, you can see the mana cost. Mana is another one of the primary resources in Magic, and it comes from lands. You need it to play spells. So, for example, this mountain is a land. If you want to play it, you can just move it straight from your hand onto the table. One of the fundamental rules about lands is that you can only play one per turn, although there are some cards that offer other ways to put lands into play. In contrast, this Lightning Bolt is an instant. To play this card, you have to cast it as a spell. Notice how the red symbol in the mountain's text box matches the symbol in the Lightning Bolt's mana cost. This means that casting the Lightning Bolt costs 1 red mana, and you can use the mountain to provide that red mana. Red is one of the 5 colors of Magic, the other being white, blue, black, and green. There are also colorless cards. If you take a look at this counterspell, you can see that there are 2 blue mana symbols in its mana cost. That means that you would need 2 blue mana to cast it, which you could get if you had 2 islands. Now have a look at this Grizzly Bears. You can see that you need 1 green mana to cast it, but there's also another symbol in the mana cost. That 1 in the gray means that in addition to the green mana, you would need 1 other mana, which could be any type. So to cast Grizzly Bears, you would need 2 mana, 1 of which must be green. Here's a challenge question to test your understanding. What would you need to cast this Day of Judgment? If you said that this spell costs 4 mana total, 2 of which must be white, you're right. In addition to the rule about only playing 1 land per turn, you can only draw mana from each land once a turn. Magic players call that tapping it, as in untapped potential, or tapping a keg for beer. To keep track of which cards that you've tapped each turn, you turn them sideways like this. This is referred to in the tap symbol, which you can see on this Copperline Gorge. This is a non-basic land, and as you can see, it has an ability that lets it tap for 2 different colors of mana. Other cards can also be tapped, which in general signifies using them in some sort of way. The first thing you do on each of your turns is to untap all your cards that are in play, but this is usually the only way to untap them, which means if you tap something during your turn, it won't be available during your opponent's turn. You might have noticed that there are several types of cards that I showed you. The type line in the middle of the card says what type of card that you're looking at. So Lightning Bolt is an instant, Phyrexian Arena is an enchantment, Grizzly Bears is a creature, and so on. We already talked about how lands are special in that you don't need any mana to play a land, you just put it right onto the battlefield. That's the Magic game term for your side of the table where you put all of your cards after you play them. Well, actually, you might have noticed that Lightning Bolt had the card type of instant. Instants and sorceries are card types that have a one-time effect and then they go to your graveyard, which is the game term that Magic uses for your discard pile. Like if you have an instruction to discard a card from your hand, that's where those cards would go to. There are rules and card effects that can send stuff from other game zones to your graveyard as well. Now the difference between instants and sorceries is when you can play them. Unlike some other games, Magic lets you play some cards during your other player's turns, and even in response to your plays that your opponents make. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Lands, as well as all the other types of cards beside instants and sorceries, stay on the battlefield and continue to affect the game, rather than going to the graveyard after you play them. The cards that you have on the battlefield are referred to as permanents, regardless of what type that they are. So, for example, artifacts and enchantments are both like this. Once on the battlefield, a permanent may have an effect on the game via its abilities. You can see that Phyrexian Arena, for example, has an ability that lets you draw a card during your upkeep, which is the part of your turn right after you untap but before you draw. The gameplay differences between artifacts and enchantments are relatively minor. In the past, artifacts had a strong mechanical identity as being colorless, but nowadays there are colored artifacts that get printed pretty regularly, and the difference between the two is mostly based on flavor, i.e. what type of magical effect the card is intended to represent. Now the last type of card that I'll talk about is creatures. There are other card types, but artifacts, creatures, enchantments, lands, instants, and sorceries are enough to get you pretty far. Creatures are important because they're the only type of card that can attack and block, and that's the primary way to win a game of Magic. Each player starts with a certain life total, and once they're gone, that player loses the game. The most common way to damage your opponent's life points is by attacking with creatures. So let's take a look at how that works. First, the attacking player, the player whose turn it is, would decide which creatures that they'll attack with. Attacking taps all those creatures so that you cannot attack with a creature already tapped for some other reason. There's also a special rule that says creatures cannot attack or tap the first turn that they come into play, which is called Summoning Sickness Rule. Unlike in some other card games, the attacking player cannot decide to attack enemy creatures directly. Rather, the player who's being attacked can choose to block each attacking creature with one or more of their own creatures. If any attacking creatures are not blocked, those creatures will deal damage to the defending player. Tapped creatures cannot block, but blocking also does not cause a creature to become tapped the way attacking does. Once blockers are declared, we need to find out the results of the combat. For that, we'll need those two numbers that you might have noticed in the bottom right corner of every creature card. The first is called Power, and this represents how much damage that the creature deals. The second is called Toughness, and it represents how much damage the creature would need to take in order to die. This Grizzly Bears is a 2/2 creature, so it deals 2 damage, and it dies if it takes 2 damage. Or, for example, this Maritime Guard is a 1/3, meaning it deals 1 damage, but it doesn't die unless it takes 3 damage. So let's say this Grizzly Bears attacks and gets blocked by the Maritime Guard. The bear would deal 2 damage to the guard, and the guard deals 1 damage back to the bear. Neither creature has taken damage equal to its toughness, so they both survive this combat. Alternatively, imagine if we had this Grizzly Bears block this Lizard Warrior. The bear would deal 2 damage to the lizard, and the lizard would deal 4 damage to the bear. In this case, both creatures have taken damage equal to or exceeding their toughness, so they both die. Note that the lizard still does not get to deal any damage to the defending player, even though its power is greater than the blocking creature's toughness. It's also not possible for any of the creatures in a combat to deal damage to the attacking player at all. As a final check, see if you can evaluate the results of a combat between this Siege Mastodon and this Crawworm. And the answer is the Crawworm will survive this combat, but the Siege Mastodon will not. Combat takes place in the middle of the turn. Before and after the combat phase, there's a main phase. Your main phases are the normal time to play your cards. Before your pre-combat main phase is the beginning phase, which consists of untapping all your permanents, your upkeep, and then drawing for turn. There are not any specific game actions that happen during the upkeep, but a lot of cards use it for recurring abilities that happen at the beginning of every turn. After the post-combat main phase is the ending phase, which is composed of 2 steps. First, the end step. Like the upkeep, there aren't any specific game actions here either, but a lot of cards that have something happen at the end of the turn will have it happen here. Then, the cleanup step. As the name suggests, this is when the game cleans things up before moving to the next player's turn. If the player whose turn it is has more than 7 cards in hand, they have to discard down to that number. Then, damage wears off of all creatures. Unlike some other games, when a creature is damaged in Magic, the damage is not permanent, nor is dealing the full amount of a creature's toughness in one shot required to bring it down. Rather, damage persists until the cleanup step, and if sufficient damage accumulates onto a creature before this time, it would die. I talked about how a lot of abilities happen in the upkeep or the end step. The game term for abilities like these is triggered abilities. The effect happens once the trigger condition is met. Any ability that starts with at, when, or whenever is a triggered ability. Now you can see that this Ball Lightning has a couple of other abilities too. Trample and Haste are what's called keyworded abilities. These are abilities that Magic cards use often enough that they shorten the text down to just a single word or phrase. Sometimes cards will have reminder text that summarizes what the ability does, but other times the keyword will just appear by itself and players will have to either just know what it means or look it up. You can see that Haste is a special keyword that lets creatures ignore the Summoning Sickness rule that I mentioned earlier, and Trample lets a creature deal excess damage to an opponent if its power is more than enough to kill all the creatures assigned to block it. There are lots of keyworded abilities, way too many to go over all of them here, but let's take a look at one more in particular. This Slagworm Armor features the Equip ability. Equipment are a special type of artifact. Like any artifact, you can cast it for its mana cost. In this case, that's 1 generic mana. Once it's on the battlefield, you can pay 3 mana to equip Slagworm Armor to a creature you control. After you do, that creature gets +0/+6. In other words, its toughness gets increased by 6. Equipping is an activated ability. You pay the cost to activate the ability, and afterwards, you get the effects. You might remember that you saw another activated ability earlier when I showed you that Copperline Gorge. See, you tap it, that's the cost, and then you get a red or green mana, that's the effect. Anything that uses a colon is an activated ability, but sometimes with keywords, the colon only appears in the reminder text. And speaking of reminder text, what does that line that says equip only as a sorcery mean? To answer that, remember what I said a while ago, that in Magic you can cast spells during other players' turns? Well, we're going to take a look at how that works now. When you cast a spell in Magic, you don't get the effects right away. It goes on the stack, and each player in the game has a chance to respond to it. If you're familiar with computer science, you already know how a stack works. If someone responds to a spell, their spell goes on the stack too, on top of the original one. Once everybody has had a chance to respond to the top spell on the stack but chosen not to, the top spell on the stack will resolve. In other words, it has its effects. If it's a permanent spell, it'll go on the battlefield. And if it's an instant or sorcery spell, its controller will follow its instructions and then that card would go to the graveyard. You might also remember how the turn in Magic is made up of several steps. If each player in a row passes on their opportunity to cast a spell and there's nothing on the stack waiting to resolve, that's how the game knows it's time to progress to the next step. Here's the catch. You cannot respond with just any spell. Most spells can only be cast during their controller's main phase if the stack is empty. Now this same thing is true for lands. This restriction is referred to as sorcery speed. This is the difference between instants and sorceries that I referenced earlier. Instants are able to be cast anytime you have priority. Most activated abilities work the same way, and you can activate them at instant speed. A few activated abilities, notably, including the Equip ability, have the sorcery speed restriction on them. Let's close out with a few examples, since the stack is something a lot of new players find confusing. It's Amy's turn, and she wants to play this Grizzly Bears. We already said that it costs 2 mana, one of which must be green, so Amy would tap a Forest and a Copperline Gorge. Because the Forest always taps for green, it doesn't matter what color she's tapping the Copperline Gorge for. Now, Grizzly Bears is the top object of the stack, and everybody in the game gets a chance to respond to this spell. What would that look like? Well, maybe Nick wants to use a Lightning Bolt to deal 3 damage to Amy. After all, any target means that he could target her and deal damage to her life points. It doesn't make a ton of sense to do that now, though. A common piece of strategy advice in Magic is to do things the last possible opportunity. Since Amy can't move on to Nick's turn without giving him one last time to cast spells during the end step, Nick would probably want to wait until then to cast Lightning Bolt. But what about this counterspell? Well, that's an instant too, so it would be possible to cast that. Countering target spell is exactly what it sounds like. Amy's Grizzly Bears would not go to the battlefield, it would go right to her graveyard if it's countered. Okay, here's another example. It's Amy's turn, and she attacks with Grizzly Bears. Nick doesn't want to take 2 damage, but he also doesn't have any creatures to block with, so he plays a Lightning Bolt to deal 3 damage to the Grizzly Bears. Lightning Bolt is now the top object of the stack, and both players need to pass before it can resolve and actually deal that 3 damage though. Amy doesn't want her Grizzly Bears to die, so maybe she wants to cast this Phyto Burst to give her bear +5/+5. That would make the Grizzly Bears a 7/7, which is big enough to survive Lightning Bolt. There's just one problem though. Phyto Burst is a sorcery, which means Amy can only play the spell in her main phase when the stack is empty, neither of which is the case here. On the other hand, let's take a look at this Giant Growth. Being an instant, it would be legal for Amy to respond to Nick's Lightning Bolt with Giant Growth in the situation we're considering. In that case, the stack would have Lightning Bolt on bottom and Giant Growth on top. The Giant Growth would resolve first, making the bear a 5/5, then the Lightning Bolt would resolve, dealing 3 damage to Grizzly Bears. Because the bear now has 5 toughness, it would survive. Let's go through that same example again, except we'll imagine that the Giant Growth and the Lightning Bolt were played in the other order. In other words, Amy plays a Giant Growth on her Grizzly Bear, and Nick responds to that spell by playing a Lightning Bolt on it. In that case, the Lightning Bolt would resolve first, dealing 3 damage to Grizzly Bears. At this point, Giant Growth has not resolved yet. It's still on the stack, and Grizzly Bears is still just a 2/2. Therefore, Grizzly Bears goes to Amy's graveyard, since it's taken damage greater than its toughness. After this, Giant Growth is the top object on the stack, but it can't give Grizzly Bears +3/+3 anymore because the bear is dead. Giant Growth just goes to Amy's graveyard without doing anything, a process colloquially referred to as fizzling. As you can see, the outcome of the play changed completely. Magic has tons of intricacies like this, which is what keeps veteran players coming back. Right now, you've got enough knowledge to navigate a lot of the common situations in a Magic game, but the comprehensive rules for Magic are over 300 pages long, so obviously there's gonna be some stuff that I had to cut out of this introduction video. Like legendary permanents, which represent specific characters, places, or objects, and therefore the same player cannot control multiple copies of the same legendary permanent at once. Or auras, a special type of enchantment that you play attached to a creature or other permanent, and that go to the graveyard when that permanent leaves the battlefield. Or planeswalkers, powerful allies that you can summon to your side. Planeswalkers have special abilities that you can activate once per turn by gaining or losing the appropriate amount of loyalty, but they die when that number hits 0, and your opponent can attack your planeswalkers to bring that total down. All of these topics and many more will be the subject of future videos in this series. Remember, this is a huge game. I distinctly remember feeling overwhelmed when I was learning this stuff myself, and that was over 20 years ago. But eventually I did. And now I'm a judge, helping run Magic events and answering players' rules questions at every level of play. You can learn this too. Maybe someday you'll be a judge. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.